No one saw it coming. The man who turned thunder into music, the guitar legend who made millions paint their faces and believe in rock and roll magic, is gone. Ace Frehley, the original lead guitarist of Kiss, has died at 74. Within minutes of the announcement, timelines exploded with heartbreak. Fans from Tokyo to New York posted silver lightning bolt emojis, the symbol of Space Ace, the man who made rock feel like outer space itself. For half a century, his riffs lit arenas. His energy shook stadiums, and his smile behind that silver paint made rebellion look holy. His family confirmed he passed away following injuries from a fall, saying he left this world surrounded by love, prayer, and peace. But peace was never the word most people used for Ace Frehley. He was noise, fire, chaos, and genius. Across the industry, tributes poured in. Paul Stanley and Gene Simmons called him irreplaceable. Younger guitarists called him the reason I ever picked up a six-string. Even rival bands stopped their shows to play. New York groove one last time. And yet, beyond the makeup and pyrotechnics, there was still that Bronx kid who once showed up to an audition wearing one red sneaker and one orange one, and somehow rewrote rock history. Tonight, we look back not just at the legend, but at the man, the laughter, the chaos, the fall, and the fire that still echoes through every amp that ever hummed his name. In his final weeks, Ace Frehley was doing what he'd always done, fighting back. Friends said he was recovering from a fall, cracking jokes with nurses, still insisting he'd be back on stage by summer. But then came the quiet, the kind of silence that hangs heavy when a life built on noise starts to fade. His family's statement arrived like a soft-spoken goodbye to a man the world only ever saw under spotlights. "We are completely devastated and heartbroken," they wrote. In his last moments, we surrounded him with loving, caring, peaceful words and prayers as he left this earth. It wasn't the sound of guitars or fireworks that carried him out. It was the sound of love. They called his passing beyond comprehension, a loss too big for words. For a man whose whole existence was volume and voltage, he left in stillness with the same humility that once made him tell reporters, "I'm just a kid from the Bronx with a guitar. At home?" His wife Jeanette lit a candle beside one of his silver boots, the same kind he wore on the Alive tour. His daughter Monique posted a photo of the two of them backstage, captioned with a single line, "Fly high, Space Ace." And just like that, an era closed, not with an encore, but with a whisper. But grief didn't stay quiet for long. Because as the news spread, the men who once shared his stage, Paul Stanley and Gene Simmons, broke their silence. Too, when the news reached them, the men who once stood beside him under showers of fire and smoke, Paul Stanley and Gene Simmons, didn't hold back their grief. In a statement that felt more like a eulogy than a press release, they wrote, "We are devastated by the passing of Ace Frehley. He was an essential and irreplaceable rock soldier during some of the most formative chapters of Kiss and its history. He will always be a part of our legacy." It wasn't just words. It was closure between men who had lived through fame, fights and forgiveness. Brothers bound not by blood, but by distortion, pedals, and decades of madness. Within hours, the Kiss Army, that unstoppable legion of fans, flooded the internet. Silver face paint selfies, lightning bolt emojis, and thousands of guitars held to the sky. In New York's Times Square, a group of fans gathered under flashing billboards, playing rock and roll all night through a portable speaker, singing at the top of their lungs like the city itself owed Ace a final scream. Across the ocean, stadiums in Japan and Brazil lit up digital tributes. Radio DJs replayed his iconic solo from "Shock Me," the one he wrote after getting electrocuted on stage in Florida, a song that turned near death into immortality. Even younger artists' names Ace had never met posted videos saying, "This man made me pick up a guitar. That's the thing about legends. They never really fade. Their sound just keeps echoing in someone else's hands, but to understand how that echo began, how a quiet Bronx teenager turned into the cosmic face of rock, we need to go back to where it all started. Before the makeup, before the lights, before the name Space Ace ever existed, there was just a Bronx kid with a busted guitar and a dream too loud for his neighborhood to hold." Paul Daniel Frehley was born on April 27, 1951, in the Bronx, New York, to a working-class family where music wasn't a hobby, it was a language. His father played the accordion, his mother sang in the kitchen, and little Paul, the youngest of three, learned early that rhythm could fix anything that felt broken. Then came Christmas, 1964. He unwrapped an electric guitar, cheap and slightly off-tune, but to him it was everything. "It felt like touching lightning," he once said. From that day on, school didn't matter much, only sound. He never took formal lessons. Didn't need to. His teachers were Hendrix, Buddy Guy, Jimmy Page, and Keith Richards. Voices coming through cracked vinyl speakers. By the time most kids were learning algebra, Ace was bending notes in Bronx basements, making noise that neighbors would later call destiny. Friends nicknamed him Ace, partly for his charm, partly for his habit of showing up to gigs with one shoe unlaced and still stealing the show. There was a spark in him that didn't fit the quiet streets of his block. He dropped out of high school for a while when his band Cathedral started earning real money at local clubs. For a kid who'd grown up with very little, it felt like the world was finally turning up his volume. He'd later go back and earn his diploma, not for validation, but to prove to himself he could finish what he started. By 1971, he was with a small group called Mullamo, signed briefly to RCA. Nothing big came of it, but fate had already written his next chapter, because 1 year later a friend spotted a tiny ad in the Village Voice, "Lead guitarist wanted." Influences, British rock, heavy sound. Ace showed up to the audition wearing one red sneaker and one orange one. No one remembers what he said that day. They only remember the sound, wild, unpolished, and undeniable. A few weeks later, he got the call. Paul Stanley, Gene Simmons, and Peter Criss wanted him in the band. They didn't know it yet, but that phone call would change the face, literally, of rock music forever. It started in a cramped rehearsal room in Manhattan. 4 guys with borrowed amps, no money, and a dream bigger than the city skyline. When Ace Frehley walked in, still wearing those mismatched sneakers, the room went quiet. Not because of how he looked, but because of how he played. One riff, one solo, and Paul Stanley turned to Gene Simmons and whispered, "That's our guy." By early 1973, the lineup was locked. Paul Stanley on rhythm, Gene Simmons on bass, Peter Criss on drums, and Ace Frehley on lead guitar. Together they named themselves Kiss. Simple, bold, instantly unforgettable. Inspired by the spectacle of Alice Cooper and the glam chaos of the New York Dolls, they decided to do something no one else dared, make their shows feel like a full-blown explosion. Fire-breathing, smoke-spewing, pyrotechnics everywhere. But what really sold it was the mystery, the paint, the masks. No one knew who they were, and that made everyone want to. Ace became Space Ace, the silver-suited guitarist from another world. His on-stage personality was cosmic, detached, mischievous, electric. The persona fit him perfectly, like he'd been born in another galaxy and just happened to land with a Les Paul guitar in New York. But the early days weren't glamorous. The New York music scene didn't take them seriously. Critics laughed, clubs paid them next to nothing. Ace drove a taxi on the side just to make rent. There were nights when he'd park the cab, grab his guitar from the trunk, and head straight to a gig. No sleep, no food, just fire in his veins. Everything changed when they met manager Bill Aucoin in 1973. He saw what the others missed. That Kiss wasn't just a band. It was theater, myth, and marketing all rolled into one. He gave them direction, financing, and most importantly, faith. In February 1974, their debut album, Kiss, hit shelves. It wasn't an instant hit, not yet, but it planted the seed. Songs like Firehouse, Black Diamond, and Ace's own Cold Gin became underground favorites. The world didn't know it, but something seismic was brewing. Still, the road was brutal. Small crowds, skeptical press, constant exhaustion. But Kiss kept touring, each show bigger, louder, wilder. Then, in 1975, everything exploded, literally and figuratively. Their live album, Kiss Alive, captured the energy no studio could contain. One track, Rock and Roll All Night, became the anthem that turned them into gods of chaos. Teenagers worshipped them, parents hated them, and Ace Frehley's smoke-belching guitar became a symbol of rebellion itself. Suddenly, that Bronx kid wasn't driving taxis anymore. He was driving arenas into madness. From bar gigs to billboards, from insults to idolization, Kiss had arrived. And at the center of it all stood Space Ace, smiling behind silver paint, knowing this was only the beginning. By 1975, Kiss had gone from local curiosities to full-blown supernovas. What began as bar gigs and small clubs had now exploded into arenas drenched in smoke, fire, and sound. Their live album, Kiss Alive, didn't just sell, it detonated. The anthem Rock and Roll All Night became a generational roar, a rebellion chanted by millions of kids who wanted to feel invincible for 3 minutes and 30 seconds at a time. Teenagers painted their faces, parents were horrified, and Ace Frehley's smoking guitar became a rite of passage for anyone who ever plugged in an amp and dreamed of escaping their hometown. He was the embodiment of cool, calm, detached, cosmic. The guy who never looked like he was trying, but always made it look effortless. As the band's fame soared, so did their ambition. They teamed up with producer Bob Ezrin to craft Destroyer, the album that would forever seal their legacy. Tracks like Detroit Rock City and Shout It Out Loud roared through stadiums, while Peter Criss's unexpected ballad, Beth, softened the chaos just enough to show the band's heart. Critics finally took notice. Kids went crazy. The Kiss logo, bold, lightning, dangerous, began appearing everywhere. T-shirts, lunchboxes, comic books, even pinball machines. The world wasn't just listening to Kiss, it was buying into the phenomenon. Their concerts became cinematic. Fire-breathing, blood-spitting, guitars shooting smoke. Every night was an explosion, every performance a ritual. And at the center of it stood Ace, that silver star glowing beneath the lights, shredding through solos that didn't just sound loud. They felt alive. 77 brought Love Gun, an album that captured everything the band had become, loud, theatrical, unstoppable. It also gave Ace his first lead vocal, Shock Me. Ironically, it came from a real moment when he was electrocuted on stage in Florida. Most people would have quit right there. Ace turned it into art. The crowd didn't just hear the pain, they heard the defiance. That's what made Ace different. He didn't fake the chaos, he lived it. And that chaos, that reckless brilliance, was exactly what made Kiss more than a band. They were mythology, but behind the fireworks and fame, cracks were starting to show. Fame had its cost, and no amount of makeup could hide it forever. Fame can build legends, but it can also crack them open. By 1978, Kiss was everywhere, on cereal boxes, in comic books, even in a made-for-TV movie. They were living gods of rock, but offstage, the magic was starting to fracture. The same energy that powered them was now burning them from the inside out. That year, all 4 members released solo albums at the same time, a bold idea that was supposed to show unity through individuality. Instead, it revealed how far apart they'd grown. Paul Stanley leaned toward melody, Gene Simmons chased theatrics, Peter Criss explored softer sounds. But it was Ace Frehley's album that shocked everyone. His record didn't just hold up, it stood out. Featuring the hit New York Groove, Ace's solo project had swagger, bite, and that Bronx pulse that fans had always loved. It climbed charts, earned radio play, and made critics admit what fans had known all along, that Ace wasn't just the band's lead guitarist. He was its soul, but inside the tension was boiling. Creative clashes, endless tours, and exhaustion fed into something darker. The louder the crowds got, the quieter the friendships became. And Ace, the man who could make a crowd of 50,000 feel electric, was starting to lose his own current. By 1980, the disco-infused Dynasty album brought a new audience but alienated the old one. Hardcore fans couldn't handle seeing their heroes flirt with dance beats. The rebellion had turned polished, and Ace hated it. He felt like a stranger in his own band. Then came the spiral. Fame turned into pressure, pressure turned into escape. Alcohol, parties, chaos, the lifestyle that once looked like freedom started chaining him down. The near electrocution that inspired Shock Me had been a warning. But by 1983, the real shock came off stage. Ace Frehley was arrested after a high-speed chase in his DeLorean. 4 cars hit. No one hurt, but the headlines hurt enough. The Space Ace had fallen back to Earth. He spent 2 weeks in detox, attended Alcoholics Anonymous, and tried to rebuild. Fans feared it was the end. But what they didn't realize was that Ace wasn't wired to quit. Underneath the addiction, the exhaustion, and the chaos was still that same kid from the Bronx who refused to let go of his guitar. He walked away from Kiss in 1982. His silver paint washed off for the last time, but he didn't disappear. He just needed to find himself again, without the makeup, without the noise and without the mask, and when he returned, the world wasn't ready for how loud his second act would be. For most rock stars, the fall is the end. But for Ace Frehley, it was only intermission. After years lost to chaos and recovery, the Space Ace found his spark again. Not in a stadium, but in a small studio filled with amps, notebooks, and second chances. That's where Frehley's Comet was born. It was 1987 and metal was at its peak. Big hair, louder guitars, endless pyrotechnics. And yet somehow Ace managed to stand out again. His album Frehley's Comet wasn't just good, it was alive. Songs like Rock Soldiers told his story without shame. I cried, I am invincible. But my only high was just a lie. It was self-aware, defiant, and brutally honest. The record went gold and critics called it one of the best comebacks in rock history. He toured with Iron Maiden and Alice Cooper, sharing stages with bands who had once grown up idolizing him. For the first time in years, Ace wasn't just surviving, he was glowing again. He laughed louder, played cleaner, and finally seemed at peace with both his past and his demons. But peace never lasted long in the world of Kiss. In 1996, the impossible happened. The original four reunited. Paul, Gene, Peter, and Ace together again in full makeup for the Alive Touch worldwide tour. It was more than nostalgia. It was resurrection. Tickets sold out in hours. Kids who'd grown up on stories about Kiss brought their own children to see what real spectacle looked like. For Ace, it was a full-circle moment. The silver paint, the roar of the crowd, the endless noise, it was all back. He played with the same cool detachment he always had, but this time there was gratitude in every note. The reunion led to Psycho Circus in 1998, a studio album that captured flashes of the old magic. Still, old habits and tensions crept back in. By 2002, Ace decided to step away again, this time for good. But he didn't fade. Over the next 2 decades, he built a legacy that went beyond Kiss. He became the mentor, the legend every young guitarist wanted to meet. Between 2009 and 2024, he released 5 solo albums that proved his spark hadn't dimmed. He jammed with Slash, Mike McCready of Pearl Jam, John Five of Mötley Crüe, and Robin Zander from Cheap Trick. Each project felt like a reunion of energy, the new generation paying tribute to the man who'd lit their fuse. And then came $10,000. Volts in 2024, his last album, his final roar. Critics called it a time capsule of everything Ace ever was. Raw, funny, rebellious, and cosmic. The riffs still shimmered with that signature electricity, and fans loved him for never pretending to be anything but himself. Even off stage, he kept creating. His autobiography, No Regrets, a rock and roll memoir, became a bestseller in 2011, filled with wild stories, humor, and reflections that only a man who'd survived it all could write. He was inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame in 2014 with Kiss, a moment that made even the toughest rockers tear up. When asked about his legacy, Ace said something that summed him up perfectly. I never set my sights low. I've always believed most people are ruined by the limitations they put on themselves. And that's who he was, a man who refused to be limited, even when life tried to confine him. In his later years, he mellowed, but never lost the glint in his eye. He played smaller venues, told stories on stage, signed guitars for kids who hadn't even been born when Destroyer came out. And through it all, that same Bronx accent, that same mischievous grin, that same spark stayed. When the lights finally dimmed, he left behind more than music. He left behind proof that legends aren't born. They're built, riff by riff, fall by fall, rise by rise. The fire may have gone out, but the smoke, the sound, and the spirit of the Space Ace, that will never die. The stage lights are off now. The silver paint, the smoke, the fire, all gone. What's left is silence, and somewhere within it, the echo of a single guitar note still hanging in the air. Ace Frehley didn't just play music, he became it. Every solo, every riff, every wild grin behind that mask told the story of a man who turned noise into meaning and rebellion into art. He once said in his autobiography, I never set my sights low. Most people are ruined by the limitations they put on themselves. It wasn't just a quote, it was how he lived. Whether he was standing in front of 80,000 fans or alone in a smoky rehearsal room, Ace Frehley believed in doing it loud, doing it different, and doing it his way. When the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame inducted Kiss in 2014, the crowd erupted the moment Ace's name was called. Even Paul Stanley and Gene Simmons, men who had fought beside and against him, stood proud. Because despite the arguments, despite the breakups and comebacks, they all knew one truth. There was no Kiss without the Space Ace. He never pretended to be perfect. He stumbled, he fell, he got back up. But that was the beauty of Ace Frehley. He was real. A man who played through pain, who turned failure into riffs, who laughed through chaos, and who somehow made every mistake look cool. When fans talk about Ace, they don't just mention the solos or the smoke. They talk about the feeling, the sense of escape, the idea that music could make you bigger than your problems, that you could be anyone, anywhere, as long as you believed. After his passing, fans gathered around murals, concerts, even old record shops to play New York Groove one more time. Some wore the silver paint, some brought their kids, and for 3 minutes and 4 seconds, it didn't matter that he was gone because the music made him alive again. In one viral clip, a fan whispered through tears, "He made me believe I could be someone." That was Ace's gift, not just his music, but his magic. The kind that doesn't fade when the amps shut off. Maybe that's why his story feels less like an ending and more like a reflection. The same way a last note doesn't vanish. It just keeps ringing softly, endlessly, through time. The world of rock has lost one of its brightest stars, but his light isn't out. It's just further away now, twinkling from somewhere beyond, reminding us of what he always stood for: freedom, laughter, and a sound that could shake the sky. So tonight, wherever you are, turn the volume up. Let the chords scream. And remember the man who once made the universe feel small enough to fit inside a Les Paul, Ace Frehley. Forever the Space Ace. Forever alive.